the allocation of scarce medical resources. For most of human history, the allocation of scarce medical resources has not been a huge ethical issue. This is because most medicine couldn't accomplish very much at all. Prior to the 1930s, a trip to the doctor was more likely to shorten your lifespan than lengthen it. By the 1960s, technology had improved so dramatically that the distribution of scarce medical resources had become a serious ethical issue. There were resources that could genuinely help people, but there weren't enough of them to go around. The first major ethical dilemma surrounding the distribution of scarce medical resources occurred at the Artificial Kidney Center in Seattle, Washington. This was one of the first centers that had kidney dialysis machines, but they didn't have enough kidney dialysis machines to serve everyone in their area who was having chronic renal failure. So they had to ration time on the kidney machines. Munson, in his section entitled A Selection Committee for Dialysis, gives a fictionalized version of what might have happened at a place like the Artificial Kidney Center in Seattle. And you'll notice that everyone on the committee very explicitly takes into account all kinds of social criteria in addition to medical need. So the question is whether people were morally worthy of time on the kidney dialysis machine. And so you get comments like this. "I don't believe she's much of a churchgoer," said the Reverend Johnson. "At least she doesn't give a pastor's name." "That's right," said Mrs. Langford, "and I wonder what kind of morals a woman like her has. Being divorced and working as a waitress and all." So the early decisions, the early microallocation decisions for scarce medical resources explicitly attempted to evaluate the moral worth of the person involved as a criteria for selection. Another important milestone in the history of allocating scarce medical resources was the decision in 1968 by a committee at Harvard to essentially change the definition of death. This was the so-called Beecher Committee. Up to this point, a patient had been considered dead once he had stopped breathing and his heart had stopped beating. But by 1968, you had heart-lung machines available, so people were able to be kept alive by the current definition, even though their brains had stopped functioning entirely. The Beecher Committee recommended that Harvard hospitals start using what's now called the whole brain definition of death. And this is discussed in the euthanasia section of Munson. In the whole brain section of definition of death, you are dead if your entire brain shows no sign of activity. Now, the thing that's interesting about the Harvard Committee is that they did this specifically so that about 10,000 patients on heart-lung machines could be declared dead and then have their organs harvested for transplant. And this will become important later on because fussing with the definition of death is again being used as a way to increase the supply of organs for transplant. Well, as time went on and medical ethics became more institutionalized, especially in the 70s, the idea of using social criteria to distribute medical resources became increasingly frowned on. So the last example I want to talk about is the beta-seron lottery. This was a drug that could help a great deal with MS patients, but there was not enough of it to go around. The manufacturer decided to distribute it basically completely randomly. There was a lottery to see who got the drug and who didn't. This is all described on page 474 of Munson. The contrast with the deliberations at the Artificial Kidney Center in Seattle couldn't be greater. Okay, this brings us to the current scene. Right now, there are still a large number of scarce medical resources. For the most part, we distribute medical resources based on the ability to pay. Time with specialists, most preventative care, elective surgery, use of MRI and CAT scan machines. These are all limited resources, and they're rationed by making them only available to people who can pay large amounts of money or who have access to government aid. The only scarce resources that are distributed by other principles are organs for transplant and kidney dialysis. Kidney dialysis because of the history of kidney dialysis in medical ethics and in the distribution of scarce medical resources. So in what follows, we're mostly going to look at the distribution of organs for transplant, because this is the stuff that is actually distributed using ethical deliberation rather than simply the free market. So there's an organ shortage. Well, the obvious thing to do, rather than looking for ways to distribute what you have, is to try and improve the supply. And a great deal of effort has been made to try to improve the supply of organs. So here's the problem. About 10,000 people a year die waiting for transplant. Now, Munson emphasizes that about 6,000 to 10,000 potential organ donors are missed. He doesn't say if that's 6,000 to 10,000 a year, but I assume it is. More broadly, only 37 to 57% of potential donors become actual donors. So it looks like we could almost give everyone an organ who needs one if we simply retrieved all of the organs that became available that were good matches. The problem, and the reason this isn't done, is basically that doctors are unwilling to approach patients' families right after their patient has died and ask them for permission to transplant organs. So a number of solutions have been made to try and encourage organ donation, to improve the supply of organs. Munson lists quite a few. Required request and required response laws. These are situations where doctors are required to ask the family if they wish their loved one to be an organ donor. Required response laws are situations where you have to check off something on a driver's license, to say whether or not you are an organ donor. Neither of these has been effective at all, and the bottom line is that doctors ignore the requirement to request organs. Another interesting thing that has been done to try to improve the supply of organs is to change the definition of death again. We saw that in the 60s, the Harvard Committee changed the definition of death from a heart-lung definition to whole brain death, and this was later picked up by hospitals around the country and then became basically a matter of law, state laws in the 70s. In any case, some hospitals are now switching back to the heart-lung definition of death so that they can once again free up organs for transplant. Other things. Presumed consent. You could just have an opt-out system of organ donation rather than an opt-in system. We would just assume that everyone is an organ donor unless they say otherwise. This has been tried in Europe, and it has failed. It has failed to increase the organ supply, primarily because doctors are unwilling to actually assume that a patient is an organ donor. Relaxing requirements on living donors. Traditionally, it was assumed that if you're giving an organ to someone, that must be a close friend or a relative, right? That you wouldn't simply give an organ to a stranger, or if you did, something is amiss. Perhaps you are covertly selling organs. These days, more and more hospitals are relaxing the requirements for organ donation. So it is, in fact, possible to give a kidney to a stranger or a section of a liver. This has also not helped the organ supply dramatically. The one solution that has never been tried, but would probably immediately flood the market with a huge amount of organs, is to legalize the selling of organs. And you have in your readings several arguments, and we'll talk about those later, about the morality of organ sales. Since efforts to increase the organ supply have been unsuccessful, we are left in the situation where we have to decide who gets organs for transplant and who doesn't. Overall, the system in the United States works like this. There are regional programs run by regional transplant centers, sometimes based out of hospitals. Each regional program has its own waiting list, which it sets on the basis of its own priorities and rules and the decisions of its own ethics committee. There is also a national organization, the United Network for Organ Sharing, and that distributes to the regional programs. The national network also has rules governing who gets what and what kind of priorities to have. The regional organizations use a variety of different allocation criteria. All regions will use basic criterion like compatibility and need. However, this is not enough to establish a list. Even once you rule out people who don't need it as badly or who are not compatible with the donor, you're still going to have more people who need organs than organs available. So there are other things that can be used to select recipients. Age is a prominent one. Also, ability to pay and social support. Because people who have organ transplants must take a lifetime of immunosuppressive drugs, they need to have a social network. They need to have friends and family who will provide the support that will enable, that will keep them centered and sane and willing to continue to take their drugs, able to continue to take their drugs. It's interesting. Ability to pay and social support often work out as proxies for the older social criteria that were used by groups like the Seattle Kidney Dialysis Committee. You don't have to go to church to get an organ for transplant. However, if you are a churchgoer, the people at the allocation center will realize that you have a support network in the people at your church who will look after you, and you will therefore be more likely to take your immunosuppressive drugs. In addition to those sorts of criteria, some regions will go ahead and use social criteria for deciding, social worth criteria for deciding who gets organs. You might be judged by your level of education, your occupation, or your personal accomplishments. No regions use race or gender, which is fortunate. When you get up to the national level, however, the law states that only medical criteria can be used. So the National Organ Network only looks at compatibility and need. And they don't look at things like celebrity status or prisoner status. And this has led to some controversial situations. Munson tells a couple of nice, of engaging stories about people who received transplant organs who were not judged worthy by many. And that this includes the famous case of the prisoner in California who received a heart transplant. People also worry a lot about giving, for instance, new livers to drunks, and also organ donation to the mentally retarded. All of this comes up because the national organ allocation system doesn't look at social criteria, and in general there's a move away from judging someone's moral character before deciding whether to give them medical assistance.